Finishing an entire army is really hard. At the beginning of a project, you're excited and riding the wave of motivation, but soon thereafter, it's really easy to get stuck in the swamp of
batch painting.
An easy solution is to cut a bunch of corners and finish as quickly as possible, but you may end up with an army that you're unhappy with. So what's the solution? Hi, I'm Scott, and I'm a display painter who's dipped his toe into the gaming world over the last few years. I've painted up a decent number of armies and warbands to a variety of outcomes, all pretty high quality if I do say so myself. In this video, I'm gonna give you my top tips that I've discovered over those years of exploring the art of army painting so you too can get that army finished to the quality you want without spending forever edge highlighting every single crack and crevice. Let's begin with a classic piece of advice. When it comes to painting an army, you should spend your time where it matters. Even if you want a high quality result, no one is looking at the crotch of your Space Marines. Even though GW puts details down there, you shouldn't be edge highlighting them. Models always have important details and less important details. The important stuff is often found higher up on the model, and I often talk about stuff like the face, head, and shoulders, but there's a lot more. Maybe a detail represents some integral part of the model, like a big magical effect of a necromancer or a glowing weapon of a spectral executioner. Or maybe there's a large surface area where you're showing off a big part of your color scheme with a nice, fun blend that's on a visible part of the model like the chest. Spend time making those elements beautiful with proper contrast, blending, texture, etc. For the surrounding cast, like belts, boots, and a random layer of cloth in between 3 other layers of cloth, don't sweat it. A single highlight over a base coat or a layer of contrast paint is good enough. Speaking of contrast paints, you are not above contrast paint or any other similar offering. I'll admit, when I first tried out these transparent products, I didn't think they had a place in my paint jobs, but I discovered my own value for them. For me, they aren't necessarily one-coat finishers, but what they are is one-layer base coats. One of the areas you're gonna lose so much time while painting up 10 dudes is base coating. 2 thin coats sounds like a pretty harmless idea until you realize you are almost doubling your time on that single step, and if it's a large part of the model, that can really add up. Base coating is easily the biggest time sink in all of batch painting, and I do everything in my power to avoid it. And one of the best ways to do that is by planning your scheme around having some kind of light undercoat to start with and using one of those heavily pigmented washes. For larger parts of the mini, like big areas of fabric, I do always add highlights on top of this step. But if I were base coating, I'd still have to do that, and I'd be working from a flat undercoat, as opposed to the dynamic result you get from something like express paint or speed paint. Due to the transparency of these kinds of paints, not only do you get darkening in the deeper details of the model like you would with a wash, but the raised surfaces also get tinted, which means if you have some kind of varied undercoat from like an airbrush, they're pulling double duty. Speaking of, airbrushes are a huge part of my speedy and high quality army painting. Remember earlier how I said I like to avoid base coating at all costs? Well, really, I meant with a paintbrush. With an airbrush, it's no problem, and you can actually go further than you think. Sure, a Space Marine or a Necron is an easy target for airbrush base coating because 95% of the model is the same color. But what if you have a model that's broken down more? You should still consider airbrushing those parts individually, but carefully. If a color scheme splits the model in half, top and bottom, start airbrushing the top components and do the bottom half second. Often, you're pointing your airbrush downwards, meaning the overspray will shoot onto the lower half of the model while painting the top, and then when you move to the bottom half, the overspray will hit the unpainted base. However, sometimes models aren't so conveniently broken up. In that case, you want to think about the angle of the overspray. Try to always point it away from a completed part. When airbrushing a second color in this way, you'll likely not be able to paint the entire detail, but that probably doesn't matter. As long as you're painting the visible parts on the model and not the armpit or the underside of the forearm, you should be good to go. Sometimes a part will come really close to another finished portion of the model, and you have 2 solutions. One, don't forget that the closer to the model you get, the narrower the beam in the airbrush is, giving you more accuracy. Also, instead of bothering with masking, just stop short of the finished part a few millimeters and finish out the unpainted portion with a normal brush. That's still way faster than base coating the whole thing with a paintbrush. Note, I'm not anti-masking. Feel free to do it when it makes sense, but it can take a very long time and even longer if you don't plan properly. For example, if you determine that masking is required, you should start by painting the smaller of the two things you plan to base coat with the airbrush. That way, you have less model to mask off than if you were to paint the bigger thing first. The last thing I'll say about order of operation is, if your scheme includes a lighter color, consider intentionally painting onto the other parts of the Mini with that color so you can take advantage of the aforementioned transparent products to speed those parts up. These airbrushing tips that I just shared do not necessarily come for free. What I mean by that is that it requires some practice with the airbrush to have the degree of control required to fully leverage these ideas. But that shouldn't stop you from attempting this and practicing. You can always start on the easier subjects and leave the harder stuff for later when you're more comfortable. If you're curious what airbrush I use to be able to do this, I'll link it below. The airbrush is a great tool for fast paintings, and oftentimes you want to zenithally highlight a model, which causes a varied base coat of sorts, lighter on the top and darker on the bottom. This caused another problem that clashed with my traditional painting thinking. When applying a highlight to something like red armor, I used to think that you generally want to apply a highlight all over the model where that armor is. But there's a problem with that. Sometimes you might have a highlight that is appropriate for the top of the model, but is likely too bright for the bottom, or vice versa. This led me to realize that when I want to paint on top of an airbrush surface, I need to mix 2 to 3 different versions of a highlight and use them where appropriate, brighter for higher up parts and darker for the lower half. You might be a little apprehensive when it comes to mixing paint for your army painting due to fear out of not getting consistent results across the army. But I can confidently say that as long as you get close enough, and there's decent wiggle room here, you will not notice when those models are on the tabletop. If you want to apply a second highlight to the red armor, I'd grab another brighter, more saturated paint and only work on the top 50% of the model. Remember our first tip, work on the parts that matter, the upper half. If I wanted to do a third highlight, I'd work on the top 10%. Make sense? This creates a lovely, motivated highlight that guides the viewers up to the top of the model, where you spent most of your time, and away from the parts you care less about, saving you time highlighting every part of that larger detail. So, to recap, you don't want to apply one brightness of highlight all over the Mini, but rather multiple where it makes sense on the model. One layer of highlight, but a variety of values. If you're a war game collector, I sell some 32mm wood elves that would work great for games like Warhammer and similar. I have 3, the Ranger, the Witch, and the Warrior. On screen now are actual reviews of these products from my website. These guys aren't your regular wood elves though. They're evil wood elves. Evicted from the nice part of the forest and forced to live in the swamp, these unhappy knife-ears have turned their hatred inward toward their brethren and the woodland creatures around them. It's freaking awesome. They're cast in resin, but not the brittle resin that you're used to. It's super flexible stuff and it's highly detailed. Also, if you're more into 3D printing, I sell STLs of these as well. If you need some hobby tools for your painting journey, I sell a massive cutting mat and also a metal carrying case for your brushes and similar tools. So you can paint on the go at the game store or just keep your tools nice, protected, and separate. All right, back to the arm painting tips. Here's a tip for arm painting that came from the display painting world. Often when painting special one-off figures, you think about something called spot colors. These are tiny little intense areas where the saturation or brightness, or both, are very high. You can apply this idea to individual models in an army, but I want to zoom out a little. Army painters are often very keen on having their entire force look completely identical. But for me, that's a little bit boring. I want some tasteful variety across my units. Don't get me wrong, I want them to look like they belong together, but every dude in my army having the exact same armor and fabric doesn't seem realistic at all and is also a total drag to paint. What if we think about the entire army like one whole display model? That means that an individual unit can be the spot color unit. I first tested this out on the mandrakes in my desert Drakari. I took the spot colors laced throughout my regular troops, yellowy orange and teal, and made that their entire scheme. When you see them alongside the entire army, they fit in perfectly, but stand out as unique, and they should. They're friggin' Shadow Realm demon assassins. I tried this again with a unit of Imperial Special Forces for my Star Wars Legion, but instead of a bright and vibrant color, I did ultra reflective gunmetal for their armor, which felt appropriate for the drab colors of the Empire. Painting should be fun, and allowing yourself to go off the rails a bit in a motivated way for a unit that maybe is a bit different really keeps the spark alive while painting gigantic armies, and it offers a nice visual break when looking at the entire collection on the board. If you're anything like me, you learned how to paint at a Games Workshop store or from the GW YouTube channel, which advertises the classic painting method of base coat, wash, layer as many times as you want, and end on an edge highlight. I have a problem with those first two steps. As we discussed, base coating is a lie. Avoid it at all costs. Secondly, do you think I want to apply what is essentially a 90% coverage highlight to the model after it gets muddied by a wash? Absolutely not. If I have to base coat, I'd much rather do it with an actual appropriate shadow color first, which will likely have more opacity than whatever midtone you planned on using, meaning you can base coat faster, and then get right into the highlight. Not only is that one whole less step, but it gives me much more control over the shadow color. I can pick any color in my collection versus whatever a wash is going to produce on top of the base coat. I almost never use washes while army painting. A wash is appropriate when you have a highly detailed part of the model and you're base coating it with a sufficiently bright enough base coat to allow that wash to come through. A great example of this is often when I paint silver metallics and hit it with a black wash. That's great and will always work. Another example might be a feathered wing or a furry cloak. You get the idea. If you need a bit of extra definition, you can always slap a recessed shade into a crevice that needs it. But don't go crazy doing this all over the model. Only do it on parts of the model that are actually visible. What a person interested in miniature painting. If I was a betting man, and I'm not, I would assume that you're not subscribed to this channel because 70% of people aren't subscribed. What the heck? Not only is it free, but if you cringe at the end of the video when I scream at you, you can unsubscribe and no one will ever notice. Back to those sweet, sweet army painting tips. Just the tip. All right, this next tip will require me to bring out some big dad energy. Son, you and I need to have a chat about your miniature painting. You need to stop being so precious about your minis. One thing that being a content creator has drilled into my brain, for better or worse, is output. I finish so much stuff because I'm on a deadline, and fairly often I may be a little unhappy with the outcome of something. But my schedule requires that I move on, and you know what happens? It turns out that it was just an in-the-moment feeling, and if I give it a little bit of space, what I was worrying about isn't that big of a deal. Y'all want your armies to be perfect, and I get that, but it's getting in the way of you having a finished army. And I guarantee if you just move on and finish that unit and add it to your growing army, you will be so satisfied when looking at that collection on the tabletop. You should fret over the things that matter, like that one-off character or an entry into a painting competition. But for a dude in a unit of other dudes, it's simply not worth it. Move on and take your learning lesson forward into your future paint jobs. Okay, end dad mode. I kind of like this though. Let's talk about damage control. Fixing mistakes can eat up a lot of time, and the best way to deal with them is by not causing them in the first place, or organizing your paint plan in such a way that a step in your process can also be error correction. Let's tackle both of those. I've noticed in my painting process that I tend to cause the most hand-on model carnage on the back of the Mini. This comes from me wrapping my hand around the back of the model when I'm really trying to get a grip on the model for control. Note, with the miniature handle, this doesn't happen all that often, but when it does, this is where it occurs. Because of this, I often paint the back of the model later on because I know if I start there, I'm more likely to wipe the paint off later in the process. I've also noticed that when I'm painting, I sometimes rest my fingers below where my brush is to get more control. Knowing that, maybe it makes sense to paint top to bottom so my fingers are always resting on a part of the model that is unfinished. Another area I notice that I cause problems is base coating parts that are near a finished part. It's really easy to get a bright silver on your finished black if the two details neighbor each other. A good habit to get into is to leave the edge highlighting of that black until after you finish the base coating of that silver. This way, if you do get some silver on the black, it'll likely be on or near the edge, and you can just paint over it with the step that you were going to anyways. Those are all my high quality army painting tips. If you want to see some of those tips in action, I'll link a few of my army painting series below for you to check out. But I want to leave you with one final thought. You and I have different standards for what we think qualifies as good, and that's something that you can, unfortunately, only discover through trial and error. There are some units in my past that I wish I had painted a little better, or units that I wasted a decent amount of time on going for an effect that isn't obvious from the tabletop. Only through experience are you going to define what good enough is for you. It's a good idea to check in with yourself after a unit is done and you've seen it alongside your other units, especially in a game. Are you happy with the outcome? Do you not notice something that you spent a ton of time on? These are important observations to hone your process to achieve what matters to you, which is the most important. That's gonna do it for this video, guys. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint more minis!